The question of this idea of what is whiteness is something that I've been preoccupied with since I had a DNA test. And, while I'm, two-thirds West African, Ivory Coast, things of that sort, Ghana, I'm a third Scandinavian. And I thought I would have like Native American blood or some Chinese because my brother looks a little bit Asian. And my father was from the Carib, from British Honduras, and there were Chinese railroad workers down there. But all of a sudden, about 10 years ago, my uncle died, and there were photographs of my great great grandfather, the Irish preacher, and realized that my maternal great grandmother was his washerwoman. And my grandfather was born out of that kind of questionable relationship. And in looking at DNA, they sort of follow me from Scandinavia through Britain, possibly the Irish part of the clan, so to speak. So it's working with all of that information and thinking about, well, what does this mean? Who am I really? Who's my audience? How do I transcend the issues that I would put in all of this would be like literally white instead of the kind of spectacle that is both black and white in that way. So I'm playing with that idea of a kind of metaphysical or meta appearance in the work itself to try to make sense of things and to also advance the work, in the ensuing month or so. I've been working on this one over here, which is a little bit more about lynching, which has preoccupied my thought process for the last year or so as more and more of the postings that I see on Facebook regard that as a kind of history. And people are now talking about, and I'm reading more about, just the intense horror and brutality of the slave era. And I'm trying to create this space that we can all be in, that represents a kind of contemporariness about the high and the low of fine art, but also one that talks about the narrative of being black and understanding that we have to face our own demons, that the devil is in the details, and that we have to begin to become aware of what that means in terms of where we locate ourselves, because we have to heal at the same time. So it's trying to find also different ideas about how one can talk about these things publicly. I found myself beginning to understand a painting is something different than I realized. It's not about just the idea, it's about this history of how form making produces a kind of concept in the painting and develops a kind of counterweight to the kinds of obstructions that get in front of it, such as content might be a kind of obstruction because that content is always being reevaluated, resituated in the context of the time in which it's being talked about. And so that was something that I felt in these recent works, a kind of passion, partly because of the events that were happening around 2014, 2015. I had been living in Delaware for 10 years at that point and didn't realize how much I had been absorbed into the fabric of the state. I was living in a Republican light neighborhood. People are fine. We get along well. I teach at a majority white university, the University of Delaware. There are a lot of young people there. The age group in Detroit, the average age was 29. Here now, it was 19. And so I had a completely different audience that I had to begin to weigh and to consider whether or not it was appropriate for me to have this kind of involvement in my work. So I danced around a little bit, dealing more with figurative kinds of spaces rather than politicized kinds of spaces. And was because I like color, because I like an informal kind of form making, I felt that it was fine to play with it and to not be so specific about what my goals were or my story was about. But around 2014, the camera phone came into its glory with the recording of these, I can't characterize anything else but as murders of these young black men and women by the police for having a headlight out, for not giving regard to the police, for maybe appearing a little bit uppity. And we were having images of like Eric Gardner, a huge guy in a chokehold on the ground, telling the police, "I can't breathe," until he died. And that wasn't so uncommon, I'm finding out, and realizing, because without that kind of evidence, it was kind of somebody's word against someone else's word. And we've always been brought up to, "Yes, officer. Yes, sir. Put your hands on the steering wheel, 10 and 2. A smile a lot. I am reaching for my wallet because I don't want to be shot," was a Richard Pryor kind of a program that he had used. We have a kind of contentious history that we're supposed to absorb, make sense of, and put into an acceptable milieu that makes a kind of story, but isn't too harsh, but is factual, but not too factual, because I don't want to have to think about this. That's the past. But now I'm seeing this past being recreated in the present and seeing how the kinds of things that are coming up by the alt-right, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, the threats against the Jewish community, this rise of hate groups. And I think this time we got to be prepared. This time we've got to speak up. This time we better make an art that documents this period and leave a record of what's going on so that future artists, people, audiences can begin to respond to what they think is a kind of history of their time, but not recognizing that it goes back to all time. I'm trying to trade on that and to question the value of an image if it doesn't contain some element of some kind of truth, which is my own. I don't tell other people they have to follow my task, but I invite them to enter into my space so that they can, if I can seduce them with color and so forth, I can get them to ask a question. If I can get them to ask a question, I can begin to have a dialogue. And if I have that dialogue, I think I've got the superior case to make in regards to the history of our cultures and how we deal with one another. So this idea of a palette started to come from my understanding of an Afro-Caribbean use of light and color and form making, not only in their art. You could look at Haitian art, for example, to see some of that color that was manifesting itself, but also in the architecture, the buildings themselves, the lightness of reflective color, which helped to shade and cool the building. In African art, you would begin to sort of see pattern and decoration covering the architecture as well, and the textiles, the fabrics. So I started to find these other cultural standards and meanings as I traveled around Western Europe, and I could see the influence of the Visigoths or the Gothic or the Juderia in these various cities and countries. This multiculturalism, which many people had claimed didn't exist, was because it was kind of, gosh, someone just told me I was wrong. Picasso wasn't influenced by African Cubist kinds of sculptures, and I think they must be right as a young person, but only to find out how wrong they were, and to begin to sort of deal with the fact that these cultural identities mean that have this need to deny the history of the world and its interactivity over the ensuing centuries and such. So this idea of a palette to me became something that was essential in terms of the kind of color I saw in the Black community as well. Even the kind of pointillism that I use has been used by other African American artists to talk about a kind of spirituality and a kind of space in that that exists in that spirituality. And I was really trying to form in my own mind a kind of history of a Black narrative that arises through the kind of colorful painting, mural making, and so forth. So if I found a certain kind of allegiance to this recent palette of color, a lot of it came from what I was seeing out and about when I lived in Detroit, when I lived in Baltimore, when I'd go up to Harlem, when I'd see the kind of inner city resources that still had a kind of gradation of light, but at the same time had sometimes disjointed color. Certainly you'd see it in the kind of memorials that would come up for death that had occurred through shootings and so forth, where people would put colorful balloons and stuffed animals and things of that sort together, because they were meant to stop your eye as you drove through those streets or walked through those streets to get a kind of attention. And I wanted and want a kind of attention, not for me, because I'm actually kind of shy, hard to believe, but for the work. I think that's something that I felt that if I had a certain scale, if the color was somewhat discordant, if I could endow the painting with a kind of meaningfulness in the structural elements of it, I could then get that person to momentarily stop and reflect and ask, well, this is beautiful. What is this about? That there was a content that existed in the scope of things that I was trying to get at. And I think that's a large part of my continuation in the pursuit of that palette. There are times in the underpainting in which I'm beginning to sort of scope out a kind of literal language. I'm trying to work out now, how do I add color to this, but not necessarily a dissonant kind of color, but a kind of washing of color over the surface of the painting. And I haven't worked out the details of it. Again, it's one of those experimental kinds of opportunities. This woman has been lynched. She was horribly, brutally lynched, and her baby was cut out of her before she was lynched. And so they killed the child as well. And so I put in two contemporary figures, the shirt that he wears, the kind of Annie Hall outfit. The relationship between the figures are kind of suggested in the writing and graffiti in the background. And then there's this pictorial space. At the bottom, I sort of create a shallow space like they're in a box, so that there is this kind of overall sense that they're confined. And then these bits of burnt sienna that I add as almost defecation across the face of the painting as a way to tie things together. And now I want to go back in And I don't know quite what I want, quite honest. I don't always get it, and sometimes I'm kind of completely shocked at where I arrive. It took me a while to recognize the inherent qualities in something like that, painting, partly because I thought I was moving in a different direction, in a way, but found out that I am kind of committed to this kind of shocking use of color and pointillism. And in fact, a gallery dealer once asked me if I thought of myself as an outsider artist because I was using that pointillism. And I realized then we were not going to make it. And later they did dump me because I wasn't talking in a contemporary framework of branding and style and the internet. And that's silly. I mean, that's not who I am. If you think that's what my work is about, you're mistaken. So it's important for me to use a palette that is somewhat shocking, that isn't necessarily appropriate for someone's living room, that does require a kind of interest in the content first and foremost, and that the color is a kind of asset that the painting has. I appreciate this opportunity, and I think that you're taking on that painting and putting it into position of having other people to question and to look at and experience is like a powerful moment and statement for me. I just feel like I won the lottery, and I have a chance now from other people to regard what I'm doing and to question its authority, but also to engage in a dialogue. And that's what I want to have happen, because I can only learn about myself through that dialogue. Because early on in my life, I found my art to be a cathartic experience for myself, because I'd make things, but I wouldn't necessarily know why or what they were meant to say or do. And other people would instruct me on what they thought I was saying and doing. Sometimes it horrified me that my mother would see a poodle in an abstract painting of mine. And I'd think, oh, there's no poodle in there. What the hell is this about? And I thought, maybe there are other things she's seeing and she's not telling me. And I think that was something that I realized over time that I had more control over than I knew. And so this idea of getting a kind of a call and respond between me and the audience is something that feeds my spirit and allows me to go on in the pursuit of ideas.